like to begin on some kind of, with a nice joke or something, which is what I typically try to do. And I'm certainly, I want to emphasize, I'm in a quite happy frame of mind. I'm very glad to be back in Berlin, and particularly to be talking here. But I also have to say, hey, look, it's no laughing matter what's been going on. Almost anywhere I go, I had to make a short trip over here, and I started in the United Kingdom, and I had the sad problem of how do I cross the street when there are exactly 500,000 plus people filing down the street. From there, that in a big demonstration on Brexit, right? That's sort of apocalypse now if you're in the UK. Then I went to Italy, and of course they were in the middle of, something of a cross between I Pagliacci and a Clint Eastwood Western with the European Commission. And it's obvious that nobody misses the potential doomsday implications of that. And then so here I am in Berlin on the eve of the Hesse elections. All right, so this is something of a problem. I decided I would try to talk about something else probably than what some people were expecting on the I want to know about the financial crisis and its effect, and I'm perfectly happy to explain why. It's basically, I was quite struck. For the sort of founding myth of my organization, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and I need hastily to say I am just talking on my own account here. I am absolutely not trying to represent anybody else's opinion. But was the financial crisis. And so I sort of sat there and looked at all these people talking about the finance. And everybody, most of the authorities, I mean, they're heavy in all the newspapers, and everything I read, even the German papers, which I read pretty faithfully. It was mostly, everybody was congratulating themselves on how great they'd been basically coming through the crisis, saying, well, we've avoided a second Great Depression. And they were also defending the correctness of the policy measures that they had taken, mostly saying, well, we made a few mistakes, but hey, you're not in depression. To which, many of you, and I wonder what's going on. I mean, I myself, I'm not the only person who had this thought, well, what about, okay, you avoided a second Great Depression, although not in the South, I think, of Europe and in some other places. But what's the connection between the financial crisis and the fact that, 10 years afterward, the entire developed countries of the West, all of them seem to be just breaking up into deep political crises. And I thought we ought to sort through that a bit. So I looked around to see what people were saying. And there is this, let's look first of all at what the political crisis consists of. And all of you know this. I think in Germany it is perfectly obvious. So I'll just skip quickly through this. The traditional alignments, we can all argue, post-World War II in Europe, even older in the United States, post-New Deal, the populist parties are attacking just about everywhere. And, of course, the thing that stands out to me and probably lots of people in this room, the center-left parties are mostly the ones that are collapsing just about everywhere. You all know these facts. I'm going to just go, forget it. France, Germany, the Netherlands, Greece, Spain, Italy, even Sweden. Everybody's losing vote shares. They spend less time in power. If they're in power, they're in with some coalition partners who are weird. So I thought it's time to try to understand this. And so I thought, well, read the literature is what, if you're an academic, that's one thing you try to do. I quickly found this some of this, these papers. There's a bunch of papers that say, well, it so happens that financial crises just naturally bring with them the growth of right-wing political parties. And these are essentially relatively long-run statistical studies. The Bromhead, Eichengreen, O'Rourke thing is for the interwar period, and then the Funke, Schulerich, and Trebisch paper actually takes a much longer time span. And I read these, and I had the usual reaction when I see lots of statistical treatments of economic history. No, this can't be right. First thing to notice is that, if the pre-war data are all left-censored, I mean, in other words, the reason you get these funny results that the right grows faster is because they usually end at the election process if anybody on the left started to grow. The most famous example in all of history was right here in Berlin. This is available in off the affidavit that Schnitzler, who was an IG Farben director, put in Nuremberg. That's an English translation. They said to me, here, did you bring your usual German slides? And I said, they told me English was the official language, and then I thought, but did not say, like the Arkansas politician who once said, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for me. That's an actual true story. But anyway, point is, this is really a left-censored series. And then if you look at the Funke, Schulerich, and Trebisch, their World War II data, the post-World War II data are mostly countries heavily, not mostly, hit by the 2008 crash. Now, they have a problem. When they wrote that paper 2 or 3 years ago, they said, good news, the political effects are temporary and diminish over time. 10 years after the crisis, almost all variables are back to their pre-crisis levels. See a problem with that? Everything is collapsing, and so they had they need an epicycle, and they need it in a hurry. And their suggestion in Foreign Affairs was that, learning by Populist explains this, to which, of course, the short answer is, and how come nobody else seems to be able to learn? Now, I admit, when I read German newspapers, I often have that viewing, but we're going to no, that's not what's going on here. Then the other thing that struck me is conspicuous exceptions to that rule, the rule of right dominance after a financial crisis, are real easy to find, and they're enormously important. Try the New Deal. The Blum government in France, admittedly an ambiguous legacy, but one that was no failure. They got holidays and weekends and things like that in France largely out of that example, though it took 10 years to sort of bring Blum back, actually. Or even Obama's 2 presidential victories. He's not a right-winger in the sense they were talking about it, whatever you think of Obama, and I don't want to get into that right now. I conclude now, don't believe this stuff. So what then is the problem? And what I want to do is look a little closer at populism first to understand the role the financial crisis played in it. And now this is where, because I got to do this in less than half an hour, I intend to speak to that. I'm just going to hit you with, it's like hitting somebody almost in the face with a cream pie. But this will make all my points for me if you properly unpack it. What I do research on money and politics too, not just finance. And so my colleagues and I do what nobody else does and put all this stuff together. A lot of people claim to, but if I had time, I could explain why it isn't, but never mind. It's the size distribution of political contributions of the U.S. political leadership in 2016. And the point, if you look at this, basically what we're running along the horizontal axis there at the bottom is the size of the contributions. And, on the left end, you're less than $200, which is there's a threshold at which you must report. And then on the right end, it's 100,000 plus. That's a lot of money, even, still, I'm inclined to say. And then we just graphed the various candidates. Now, some of these people may not be household names to you. Paul Ryan is the Speaker of the House, still. Mitch McConnell is the leader of the Senate. Now, you look at McConnell and you realize, what? This guy's getting, 90% of his stuff and $100,000 or bigger. And you could say, okay, those are Republicans. What do you expect? Although nobody, to my knowledge, usually expects that. And then we did Trump. on which I have spent a lot of time, and we're not going to do it today. But Trump, basically, you can see, gets a lot of money in that batch, too. This was for his 2016 campaign. On the other hand, Hillary Clinton actually got more. And the only person who didn't was Bernie Sanders. You know, Sanders, you can see it at the bottom there. It's like a worm crawling along the ground, right? And if you look at the other end, 60% of his money is coming in amounts so small you don't have to report. Now, you might ask, what has the Democratic congressional leadership done? We're just about to publish that. They're actually midway between Ryan and McConnell. They're both hot. The point here, in other words, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. But my point is this, is that there's clearly two different forms of populism. I'm going to just stipulate that Trump counts as a populist. I mean, that's usually the way in Europe everybody picks it up. But so does Bernie Sanders. And there's two forms, not one form of populism. This distinction is largely missing in the European literatures, and which often turns out to derive from the Latin American discussions and just ignores a lot of other stuff. And it's missing in most of the American discussions. In the 2016 election, both are on display. Now, you're going to tell me, I know, because it's not the first time I've talked to a European audience, this is really an American pathology on all this cash stuff. I want to just pursue this for a second. So what's top-down populism mean? And, you know, what it means to me is that you've got differences in investor blocks between the parties. Why? Because forget median voter theory. All this business about how we will all go to the middle or something, not true. But you can only make appeals you can finance, and it doesn't matter what the rest of the population wants. And so parties are, I always look at parties first as bank accounts, and then Europeans say, but our parties are really not that. We get lots. Well, take a look. I want to make this point because it's enormously important for understanding Europe. Campaign money is some form of money, but I would direct your attention to that payments, that second one, the light blue, payments to political figures there. This really matters in the European Union. I can come up with some examples later. My favorite case of this, though, is in the United States, where one of the Obama advisors was collecting almost $1 million a year from a Wall Street investment bank before he went in. What was his job? Advising on philanthropy. Those of you, who sort of are into some forms of statistics would realize, what is the chances that that's a market rate for advising on philanthropy? That wasn't a market rate. Okay. And I want to caution everything that in the end, the problem of money in politics is the problem of money in society, and in particular, the regulatory situation. And here in Europe, you are as fully in this as any U.S. situation, in which basically what I did there is the bottom blue graph, again, looks like a sort of snake gradually crawling pathetically along the ground. Or what they pay, the highest rates of the federal service in the U.S., and then I graph various Wall Street salaries there. And the lesson you're supposed to derive from this is if you walk out of a regulatory job, you can make yourself incredibly rich really fast. For those of you who sort of are into the Bible, I'm not, but there are lots of people who are, it's like when Elijah and these people just get carried up to heaven in a golden chariot. Now, I have to say that I think the waiting period for European commissioners is getting rather short on some of this stuff. But the other point I want to make is when my colleagues and I started working on elections in the United States, everybody said, first of all, this sort of thing can't happen, and second of all, and it would never happen outside the United States, which is when we ran percentage of two-party total money against the outcomes, what we discovered was a straight linear function, what we've taken to calling the linear model. And this has swallowed a lot of people's attention. They will sometimes come back and say, well, really, what must be happening is the money is following the polls. We can rule that one out. I won't get into that. But my point is this. When somebody finally did the French data on an INEC grant, the lady found that 20 years of municipal elections and parliamentary elections in France look quite like that. They're straight lines. They're linear models. All of the U.S. elections for which we have data look like that. But where I come out on this is that the testable implication is that you can actually account for party differences to a considerable degree by just looking at, the differing financial bases of them. I'll move up to that in a second. This is a different kind of argument than, say, the latest Thomas Piketty piece, whose work I quite admire, but here I can't swallow it. Piketty suggests that in the West you have high education elites with sort of high income, high wealth elites. My graphs refute that. That's over. I mean, there is no way you can save that hypothesis, but if you do them, it's just generally not true. I mean, when you open up that French data, which no French person has done yet, they are not going to find that those linear models were just all coming from educated people versus business. They're going to find differences across sectors. I also think that the whole emphasis on education here is missing the point that in the information age, we have a strong tendency to have way more PhDs and high education folks around. Many of those are in the U.S. and elsewhere are turning into socialists because they can't find work. This is literally true in a place like New York City. Eventually we're going to have to sort of deal with this. But my general point is you can actually model parties with their financial bases and their voting bases. But just laying it out. When you do, so you can see the sort of thing you get. I don't want to pay attention to the details. In 2012, and the reason I pick on 2012 is it was a sort of normal election. I mean, if you think 2016 was normal, I think I can easily persuade you it wasn't there in the U.S. You see, for instance, on the Republican side, there's this huge block of heavily polluting industries. Then on Obama's end, you can see a big block of telecommunications, electronics, even the defense folks. When Trump ran, Trump was mostly financing himself with an utterly distinctive pitch. And I don't want to belabor this because I want to get to my... basically, I mean, it's a story we've told in a paper that's out on the INET website. It's out in another book, too, in a slightly bigger version. But the bottom line is that Trump was walking around as late as May saying, I don't need anybody's money, I can do it myself. And maybe that is a... And then he discovers, no, he can't. And where we end up with, in the story we tell, you see two big waves of money for Trump. Around convention time, you will be astonished to discover that there were lots of companies seeking tariffs who suddenly show up, steel industry most prominently, in the Republican contributors. And then when the campaign had its crisis in August, and famously Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway came in, they got tons of money from big private equity firms, casinos, and other market fundamentalists opposed to Clinton. This is going to lead to a generalization that affects Europe. This is why I'm going through this right now. And in the case of the American election, I finally got tired of reading the political science lit. It's been sort of canonically referred to by all kinds of folks. Paul Krugman wrote a famous column on it, just saying, look, there's no economics in the American 2016 election. It's all race and gender. That's false. Ben Page and I are publishing in the next few days a paper that just walks you through the American National Election Survey, and there's economics all over it. This is not to try to tell you that race and gender didn't play a big role in it. They did. But you cannot get the Trump victory just out of those. And I think this is actually quite generally true in Europe. Some of that literature is now out. Timo Fetzer on Brexit in Britain. There are some papers, a few on Germany, with more coming. There is work by French sociologists, though I don't know any really hardcore economic analysis there. But the point I want to make is, in general, with populism, you are not just dealing with appeals on immigration or race or anything else. There is a solid, often economic a pitch to it, and often when you analyze it, it's people who are feeling and actually are living, which is a point that a lot of surveys don't get when they ask them about their income, in regions that have been left out, as it were, of whatever growth globalization is bringing you, if it's bringing you any at all. The point I wanted to make here is there was a lot of late money for Trump. It broke, and he managed to sort of squeak across. Now, the fact that globalization steadily creates a dual economy, which is a big proposition, it's a lot to swallow, but there's a lot. I mean, you know all this, or you should, and especially IMK, where a lot of the research does touch on these themes. In this kind of a context and austerity, then race and immigration become hot buttons. And now, I want to go back to the statistical studies that I opened with and just give you where I come out on all of this for what went wrong in the great financial crisis. And, why are the left parties collapsing everywhere right now? Because you find another pattern. It's not that sort of pattern of right dominance or something like that. What you see is this when you look at those, what I call the in, out, in rule, which is pretty straightforward. People just vote out who's ever on doing whatever they did at the time the crisis hits. Then if at one point or another, most left parties come to power. They came to power in France. Germany, we know, would be a kind of coalition outcome, and Obama. And then they have to do something. Now, in the New Deal, for example, and under Blum, they did things. And in the U.S. case, they rewrote the politics of the thing for a generation. Now, right-wing parties don't usually have that problem. Often when you study their leadership, they don't really want to do anything. Sometimes they do, but typically they want to make a pitch at it and then do something else like say, restore all the German banks to private ownership, which, of course, is one of the first things that he was pledged to that at the day he came in. And Schacht was there as a kind of guarantor, though he didn't get the job for a few weeks as head of the central bank, a point that lots of histories about state-controlled and the Nazi economy somehow leave out. Anyway, my point, so why does this crisis fall so heavily on the left of center-left parties? Is that virtually all of these bought into neoliberalism, New Labor, fiscal austerity, you all know this. So they failed the Great Recession test, and they'd already compromised themselves before that. But the failure to deliver on the Great Recession following the financial collapse, that's fatal. It's really fatal. And unless they come out of this with something radically new in economic policy, there'll be no recovery. Now this leads to my sort of big generalization on when does populism triumph. I'm going to stipulate that it triumphed in Brexit, and it triumphed in Trump's case. It's up in the air mostly in Germany, but the point is that, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, you have really large free market fundamentalist movements. I mean, the large private equity firms in America don't really have any correlate over here, although they are moving into Europe on a big scale. But they're fundamentally still based on America. And when you study, they actually put up a lot of the cash that put Trump over. That's just a fact. I can prove it. I actually have a daily log of all the cash in, a graph in another presentation, and I know where it's coming from in the Trump case. But the same also in Britain, where, even Rupert Murdoch and other people were running campaigns against the European Union for a very long time. And indeed, one of the first of the British minor parties was, the one Sir James Goldsmith tried to start back in the 90s. I mean, this is sort of fairly serious stuff. Now, this leads to the question, in Europe, I think most of the major business groups still favor the European Union. My candidate, however, is what in Italy and Spain, I think you are perhaps moving into a danger zone. Here's the way I sort of leave you with. I don't think this is metaphysics at all. I think you can tell a happy business community largely out of its stock market, or some, and with a bigger assessment, if you like, of other forms of wealth that people have only begun recently to learn to chart. And the thing that strikes me is after the great financial crisis, you know, the French and the German stock markets just went up and up. Never mind what happens in the last week. I mean, this is, but Spain and Italy haven't made anything. In Italy, you can see, like, you know, fiat may stand for the whole place. It just up and left. And then I saw the obit for, what was it, Benetton last week in the Financial Times, where he said, well, they were thinking of moving the whole enterprise out of Italy. And presumably that is left to a task for the heirs. Yep. And so I'm just over as my time literally runs out. And on that note, I would like to wish you all a happy Halloween, which I know you celebrate in Europe. Okay?